Russia's control of eastern Ukraine has not changed from around 20%. And ultimately, therefore, how much does that play into the strategic decision making of, be it Moscow, Brussels, DC, let alone Kyiv? I think that's more the emphasis. If they freeze the current line of contact as it is, then they can remilitarize and double down, and then they can use that latest point.
That's why Vladimir Putin is asking for this as part of a trade or a land swap, in his words, saying to Donald Trump, one of the things that we can discuss about ending this war, right, on Putin's terms is giving up the western part of Donetsk region to Russia in exchange for freezing this front line. Nor does it want to de jure officially recognize Russian control or sovereignty over any of the territory that Russia's taken. It's failed to take for 11 years.
This is the Global Gambit.
After a deluge of diplomatic activity, we are no closer to a ceasefire, let alone peace, with Ukraine and Russia seemingly barraging each other on a daily basis. Trump's efforts to bring the two closer together seems to have been, well, that's it. He's now saying either I'll double hit Moscow with sanctions and tariffs, or I'll just do nothing at all and leave them to it. Basically, we are no different than we were in July. But to help make sense of this, I'm joined by my guest today, Christopher Miller, the Financial Times chief Ukraine correspondent, who has been reporting from the country for over a decade, including on the Maidan Revolution, through the full-scale invasion, and also the author of the award-winning The War Came to Us, Life and Death in Ukraine. So someone who, frankly, I think, understands it better than basically anyone. Chris, I'm delighted to have you on the show. Thank you very much for joining. And I think the first question in this first of two parts, as we like to do on the Global Gambit, is I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your views on the military side, because it is Independence Day as we record this on August 24th, and a lot of emphasis is about the micro but still incremental gains that the Russians seem to be making in the East. Can you break down exactly what's going on there, and do they matter or not?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll sort of zoom out and just present a sort of big picture. Since we're speaking on Independence Day, this is Ukraine's 34th Independence Day, right? Independence from Russia, from the Soviet Union. That in and of itself is a success story, right? This, burgeoning democracy, under fire from Russia currently, but surviving. It's got roughly 20% of its territory occupied by Russia. And as you pointed out, Russian forces are grinding away slowly but surely, taking more land. But Ukraine is a sovereign country, and it's celebrating Independence Day today. And there are, of course, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops who are celebrating, or rather holding firm, across a 1,300 kilometer front line. So that front line currently is shifting, as it has been. It's a fluid front line. There's no freeze across this 1,300 kilometer stretch of territory that kind of curves around in a crescent shape from northeastern Ukraine all the way down to Zaporizhia region in the south. Russian forces are making gains, particularly around, let's say, three sort of hot spots. One around Kupiansk in the northeast, in Kharkiv region, one around Konstantinovka and eastern Donetsk, the eastern Donetsk region, but on the western part of that region or oblast. And then also just a little further southeast of that, in a town called Pokrovsk. So some of your listeners, I'm sure, will have heard the names of those cities before. They've become, datelines in news stories and talked about by President Zelensky himself. And in those locations, what we're seeing are, the penetration of small groups of Russian forces across Ukraine's front line. These are Ukraine calls them sabotage groups or reconnaissance groups. They're typically 2, 3, 4, 5 guys, sometimes on electric scooters, on foot, on electric bicycles or regular bicycles, sometimes now on motorbikes, dirt bikes. The Russians, that is, are forced to use these sort of small, groups to penetrate Ukraine's front lines, because as opposed to 3.5 years ago, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, it's no longer able to use these large mechanized assaults and pushes to gain territory. The Ukrainians aren't either. Now, the reason for that, and why we're seeing this big change, is because of the prevalence of drones. Small first-person view drones, or FPV drones, along with these fiber optic cable drones that are incapable of being jammed because they have this hairline cord that connects them to their operators that can stretch upwards of 40 kilometers, are being used to essentially look over the battlefield and attack just about everything that moves, right? So what we've seen is this big shift away from an artillery war and heavily mechanized units in favor now of these really small, mobile tactical groups. So if you look at, for example, Deep State, which is a Ukrainian outfit that tracks the war. They have a website where every day they update the front line and the movements across that front line. You'll see that it looks not like this perfect crescent shape, but rather this really kind of jaggedy line with several little smaller crescents across that line. And this is emblematic of how the war has changed. So these small groups are now making progress, pushing forward maybe 1, 3, even at times 9 kilometers, sometimes being cut off, being pushed back, but it's the heavy armor that is only able to follow much later. That means that it's getting a little bit more difficult to track progress across the front line. It also means that because of this prevalence of drones, the Russians are taking heavy casualties. President Zelensky said, I can't recall if it was at the beginning of this month or early August or late July, in which he said, the ratio of battlefield losses, casualties, killed and wounded, is in Ukraine's favor, about 1 to 3. So for every one Ukrainian soldier that is being either killed or wounded on the battlefield, the Russians are taking 3 casualties, killed or wounded. And so there is, despite Russia's manpower advantage, which it does have simply because of its larger population and the large salaries that it is using to recruit new soldiers each month, and we know it's around 30,000, maybe upwards of even 33 or 4,000 new recruits a month. They do have this manpower advantage, but they're taking heavier casualties than the Ukrainians. Now that's rather typical of a army that is on the offensive, right? But sometimes we do see these larger casualties when they try to use any kind of larger grouping of troops, any units to push through. So just to go back, that's why we see these kind of small penetration units being used on the battlefield. And because the Russians are having some success with that, albeit slowly, it's this real kind of grinding nature that we're seeing. It's a war of attrition.
Yeah, I mean, you made me think of the rule of 3, right? The rule of thirds for deployment, where you need, 3, if it's the attacking force, you need 3 for every 1 defensive or whatever individual. But, on this point, I've got two points that I want your reaction to, or sort of aspects, which is that on the one hand, we have always Putinists or pro-Kremlinites who emphasize that, Russia is winning. Obviously, it's absurd to look at this war as so binary that one is losing or winning. But they always argue that, because the Russians are taking another field, another hay bale, they are winning. It's only a few meters at a time. What relates to that, and sort of what I would love your thoughts on, is it's sort of a bit of a paradox, really, in my mind, because at the moment, we seem to have this very nimble sort of way that the war is being conducted, low intense sort of amounts of industry equipment being used, right? It's not tanks, it's drones, it's bikes, it's scooters, as you said. And yet there's such little movement. The war is grinding on in a very sort of heavy way. So it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? The drones seem to be being more used to hit behind the lines, the supply lines in Russia, the infrastructure in Ukraine, than it is really the actual battlefield front. Is that a crude assessment, or is there some accuracy to sort of this, my poor interpretation?
No, a lot of that is right. A lot of that is right. I think, there are so many drones in the air at any one time, hundreds, if not thousands of drones across Ukraine and the battlefield front. at one time, right? And so there are various different types of drones. You've got the longer range, bigger Iranian designed Shahed drones that the Russians are now mass producing themselves at scale, called Garans. And those are the things that attack deep in the rear. Those are what we hear about when they attack Kyiv or Lviv in far western Ukraine, or some of the other larger urban cities and critical infrastructure, well beyond the front line, right? And then it's these small FPV drones that are operated by troops with VR headsets and joysticks, and then other similar small quadcopter drones and Mavic style drones that drop bombs on top of positions. You've got these various layers of drones that are either attacking the rear, attacking the front, or in the Ukrainians' case, also defending the front line, right? The Ukrainians have imposed this, what they call a wall of drones, right? Or a line of drones. And this is a project that was implemented last year, where essentially they've created this wall of, always available small drones that are surveying the battlefield and trying to keep Russian advances at bay. So this this is a war where the front line is shifting minimally. We're not seeing sweeping advances like we did in the early days and weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion. We're seeing incremental gains on the battlefield. I think it's an interesting question. Does it matter if it's a wheat field here, a tiny village there, a section of a highway? And I would argue that it does. Now, I don't think that the Russians and Vladimir Putin care a whole lot about taking more territory for the sake of territory. I don't think this is about territorial conquest. I do believe that Vladimir Putin wants to destroy Ukraine and create this failed state and to occupy enough territory to allow it to apply pressure on Ukraine to achieve that goal, and also to destabilize Europe and recreate a global order and an international security order, right? He wants to essentially fracture NATO and turn the West against itself, and this is all part of this broader plan. But when it comes to the battlefield itself, why these advances, as incremental as they are important, is because it adds to that pressure that is being built on Ukraine. It also creates this narrative that the Russians and Vladimir Putin can use when he speaks to President Donald Trump. He can say, our army is still marching forward. We're winning the war here, right? The Ukrainians haven't been able to stop us. So this is something that he uses, no doubt, in his favor with Trump to, again, dial up the pressure on Ukraine. If you think about it, him sitting down in Alaska, we know that that's a lot of the narrative that Putin was pushing, that this is only going to, his army is still advancing and moving forward here. He is winning the war. He's not shown that he's willing to make any concessions. One is because he still has momentum on the battlefield. His troops are advancing, even if it is, incrementally. And two, he hasn't been made to concede anything yet on the battlefield. Another reason why even these small gains are important, and Ukraine would benefit certainly from stopping them, is that they're now pushing on a key belt of strongholds in the Donetsk region, Pokrovsk being one of them, Dobropilya, a coal mining city that's just north of Pokrovsk, and Konstantinovka just to the east of Pokrovsk, and I mentioned that earlier. North of those cities, there are two other major cities that have been, one of which has been the adopted regional center of Donetsk since Donetsk city was occupied by Russia in 2014. That's Kramatorsk. The other major city just beyond that is Slavyansk. These together with Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk and Dobropilya form the westernmost part of Donetsk Oblast and this bulwark against the advancing Russian forces. They are the most heavily fortified cities that Ukraine has on its eastern front because they have faced Russian offensives since Russia's first incursion in 2014. So they're built up, they're militarized. Losing them, as has been proposed by Vladimir Putin in exchange for him freezing the front line in the south, and this is what he offered to Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and the president himself, right, in Alaska. Giving up this western part of Donetsk Oblast would very likely in the future be used as a launch pad for the Russians to go further into Ukraine. So these incremental gains, they cost Russia a lot. And yes, if you look at deep state, this map, group that tracks the war, these all look like small gains, but they do matter, because first of all, it's Ukrainian land that they're taking. And it's not Russian land. This is Ukrainian land, and every day a little bit more gets gobbled up by Russia's army. And second of all, it creates this narrative for Putin to argue to Donald Trump and anybody else that their army's still advancing, momentum is in our favor, right? And then third of all, it compounds the pressure that Ukraine is facing and feeling 3.5 years into this full-scale invasion. So that's why, even though these gains are small, they're not insignificant. And we can talk, if you want, about the challenges that Ukraine faces and why these continue and they haven't been able to stop them. But until I think this front line does freeze a bit more than it is, and this momentum is stopped, things aren't really going to turn around on the Eastern Front for the Ukrainians.
No, it's a compelling argument, and I think the main emphasis from those who say it isn't necessarily mattering is it's more because in all the time since Putin launched this full-scale invasion, Russia's control of eastern Ukraine has not changed from around 20%. And ultimately, therefore, how much does that play into the strategic decision-making of, be it Moscow, Brussels, DC, let alone Kyiv? I think that's more the emphasis. But your point about sort of being used as a launch pad is very, very noteworthy and something that you've helped refine sort of thoughts I've had in the back of my head when I'm thinking about it. Like, it's always this point that the Russians could, if they freeze the current line of contact as it is, then they can remilitarize and double down, and then they can use that latest point. But if these are some of the most fortified points that the Ukrainians have in a defensive posture, then certainly that can be calibrated for more offensive means. Yeah, certainly. But
right. And not to jump into the diplomatic side real quick, but just to add to that, that's why Vladimir Putin is asking for this as part of a trade or a land swap, in his words, saying to Donald Trump, one of the things that we can discuss about ending this war, right, on Putin's terms, is giving up the western part of Donetsk region to Russia in exchange for freezing this front line. Obviously, this is Ukraine, doesn't want to give up any of its own territory or any more than what is currently occupied, right? Nor does it want to de jure officially recognize Russian control or sovereignty over any of the territory that Russia's taken. It certainly doesn't want to give up this swatch of territory in Donetsk Oblast that I just mentioned for those reasons, that it is this bulwark against the Russian army and has been since 2014, as it would hand Russia an area of land that it's struggled to take for 11 years. It's failed to take for 11 years, right? So this would just be essentially a handover. And then we have the historical element of this, right, which is anytime Russia has controlled a swatch of territory and had a lasting pause or a freeze in the conflict for a period of time, it has then regrouped, rearmed, and used that to launch a new offensive, right? We saw that with Crimea, which it used as a launch pad to send forces north into Kherson region, right? And then in the occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk, that's where they launched their eastern or their westward push from the east in 2022. So having secured this western part of Donetsk Oblast, taking everything, or being given rather, everything in within this administrative border of Donetsk, would allow them to essentially do the same thing if Ukraine is not provided security guarantees as part of a lasting settlement, right? So the big fear is that Russia, in a deal that isn't beneficial to Ukraine, is somehow offered or given this territory in Donetsk for a ceasefire, but not something that is a lasting peace with security guarantees strong enough to dissuade Russia from launching a new attack. And then 2-3 years from now, after it regenerates its army, builds or is able to stockpile all of these missiles and drones that it's building now, and then would have tens of thousands of them, right? It could launch a new massive attack against Ukraine. So that's That's the concern.
No, for sure. And I think, history has shown in military framings that any form of a pause will benefit the offensive side, right? More than the defensive, especially when it's this disproportionate battle between these two. But I was going to leave it until the second part, but given it's such a compelling point, I'm going to ask it now, which is obviously the biggest. I made a point about this in another video, my own analysis, which is simply that, well, you've alluded to it essentially, which is a peace deal is effectively much worse than a ceasefire because it effectively means that any concessions or transferring of land is formally recognized, right? It's ingrained. Whilst a ceasefire, there is no formal reallocation of territory, right? It's all temporary because this isn't a final established set of new norms, right? So Trump's desire to sort of gung-ho and somehow reach some peace deal, which is obviously just assuming that everyone just goes along with it, which is why I think it's always very entertaining to hear what he has to say, is tell me your reactions as someone who's always there talking to people in Kyiv on the front lines, right? Trying to sort of speed through towards a full peace deal when the implications of that are far, far, more serious than I think the White House, this administration seems to understand.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So, a peace deal on Russian terms.
Sorry to overwhelm you with questions there, Chris.
No, that's okay. I'll see if I can break it down. I mean, look, first of all, any quote unquote peace deal that would be on the terms of Vladimir Putin, as told to him, or as told to Donald Trump in Alaska, would not be a peace deal, right? The only, I firmly believe that the Ukrainians and their European counterparts are right in that there can only be a lasting peace here if there are security guarantees for Ukraine strong enough to deter Russia from launching another attack in the future. Now, those security guarantees would have to look like, in a best case scenario, something along the lines of what is being discussed by Ukraine and the Europeans right now with Donald Trump's administration, although I'm skeptical as to, just how much support the US under Donald Trump is willing to provide under these, but it would be something that is an Article 5 type response, meaning NATO countries, but not NATO itself, who signed up to secure Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, would respond with some kind of military force against Russia should it break whatever kind of peace deal is negotiated, right? And so you might have, I guess in a best case scenario here, since this is all very speculative, you might have the US signing up to secure the air above Ukraine. Maybe that is air defense systems. Maybe it's jets. Maybe you have Poland or the UK also providing some of that air support. You'd have other countries like Germany, France responding in their own way. That could be flooding the country full of high-powered weaponry to defend it. It could be some kind of boots on the ground unit that is able to respond to a new Russian offensive, whether it be from the north or the east or again from the south, right? So it would have to be that kind of a response without, and this is key, without Russia having the veto power to squash that. So what Russia is saying, what Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister have said just this last week, is that any kind of security guarantee for Ukraine, which in theory they support, must also include Russia's participation. But how can you actually have a real security guarantee with the participation of the aggressor here? Ukraine has had that before, and it's learned from the past. In 1994, you'll recall, Russia, the UK, and the US signed what was called the Budapest Memorandum. Now, this was supposed to help secure and guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Now, of course, it hasn't, because one of the signatories on that was Russia. So they want a deal that is worth the paper that it's signed on, and that can't be the case if Russia is a signatory. And so a real security guarantee is only going to be one that is backed by NATO forces, not NATO itself, but by the forces of a NATO country and a coalition of the willing is what they're calling themselves right now, with US support. Now, to get to that point, a lot of things are going to happen. First of all, again, Vladimir Putin and his army have momentum on the battlefield right now. Nobody in the White House is really applying enough pressure to get Putin to the negotiating table to make serious concessions. Despite what Donald Trump's administration and all of his aides are saying out there, that he has gotten concessions from Vladimir Putin, that just isn't the case. We've seen after this meeting in Alaska, Putin go back to Moscow and say he's not ready to meet Zelensky one-on-one like Donald Trump wants to see happen. He's not even ready to have a trilateral meeting with Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, right? So he's also not willing to pull his army out of various places in the south or the east. He's really not willing to make any kind of concession. So until this war becomes much more costly for him, we're not going to see him back down and make any concessions. And so that's sort of the situation we're at, I think. And I do believe that this momentum on Donald, that has been that is a consequence of Donald Trump's efforts to secure a peace here is generally good. Right now, we are seeing European officials work very quickly to come up with what could in effect be a working security guarantee for Ukraine, and come up with a coalition of forces who decide who's to provide what in the future once a deal is reached, right? It will be very good to have some kind of operation decided on and roles divvied up for when there are serious negotiations and the Russians and the Ukrainians sit down with or without the Europeans and the US and decide how this thing is going to end. But, Donald Trump is somebody who doesn't like dealing with details and gets very impatient when things don't go his way. He also has, for some strange reason, a real affinity for Putin. And despite this, more positive White House Oval Office meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky last week, he's had more animosity towards the Ukrainian president. And so I think that's something that is very much on the Ukrainians' minds in Kyiv. The longer this drags on, the more concerned they're going to be that they are viewed by Donald Trump, who has Vladimir Putin whispering in his ear, that they are the impediment to peace. So there is this attempt right now to move very quickly, the Ukrainians and the Europeans together, to get Donald Trump to agree to what the Americans are willing to provide in terms of security guarantees, and to have that ironed out, so that when the Russians are prepared to negotiate, or if and when the Russians and Vladimir Putin are willing to negotiate in earnest, that this will be there for them to implement. But again, there are
multiple
real concerns that Vladimir Putin is not ready to end this war yet. And if you were to ask me, I think we're really only at the very beginning of any kind of peace talks and nowhere near the end.
Yeah, I would say, any effort to really engage Russia, or specifically Putin, is at this point in time an exercise in futility, right? Putin is never going to meet with Zelensky because that would require him to see not just Zelensky, but Ukraine as a whole as an equal, which he doesn't. It is a subordinate to the Soviet Russia that he wants to recreate. But as we unpack that further, everyone, you're going to have to join us in part 2. We'll be back.